Welcome to the OurOakville Podcast, where we discuss the importance of belonging in the place that you call home. These conversations are centered around a sense of belonging in the beautiful town of Oakville, Ontario, though the reflections and experiences shared are applicable across the globe.
Oakville, as we know it today, is rich in its history and modern traditions of many First Nations and Métis. We acknowledge the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation as being the rightful stewards and title holders of this land.
The views and opinions expressed are those of the podcast participants. Any content provided is of their opinion and may not reflect the opinions of the town of Oakville. OurOakville is for belonging. In this episode, we discuss the mission of the OurOakville Podcast and the importance of building a sense of belonging for all. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first episode of the OurOakville Podcast. We hold these conversations in order for us to unpack the importance of belonging in the place that you call home. And for us, that's beautiful Oakville, Ontario.
Beautiful Oakville, Ontario.
My name is Daniel Ridsdale. I'm a community development specialist with the town of Oakville. This is my partner and co-host,
Nabeel Rahman, another community development specialist for the town of Oakville.
So this podcast is hosted by the town of Oakville. We will have many partners in community join us for conversations, and we do this so we hope that we can have some purposeful, meaningful conversation about areas of attention that, you know, folks who enjoy the land and enjoy being residents of Oakville want to have. And we've certainly been having them over our time as community development specialists, and we felt like it would be important for us to share it in a public space.
Yeah, I think, when it comes to what COVID has, or how it has impacted our ability to connect with residents and the programming that we're able to offer, virtual programming and the fatigue that comes from, being in a virtual space is real. And so we figured a podcast is a platform that we can try out to really have meaningful learning conversations, but in a manner that might be not what we're accustomed to, right? The informal, but yet productive, efficient nature of a podcast really allows us to explore topics that maybe through our traditional virtual programs you might not have been able to. And as we explore more podcasts with more community partners and talking about the topics of belonging, I think you get a different perspective that might not be captured in our traditional programming. So really looking forward to seeing what develops from this.
Yeah. And we've talked about doing this for some time, Nabeel, and I know COVID kind of forced us into getting creative with programming that the town was offering. For us, I think we were really inspired when we saw June coming up on the calendar, and we saw that June celebrates so many different things. So June is National Indigenous History Month. June is Seniors Month. We celebrate Pride through the month of June. June is Recreation and Culture Month. There are so many things that, deserve acknowledgement. And we figured if we were to do a podcast now, maybe those are some of the conversations we could have. I feel very, very fortunate in my position that, I get to have intentional conversations with residents and community members and community leaders all the time. I really get to enjoy what a beautiful place Oakville is to live in and work in. And it's unfortunate that, maybe those who are very busy with their lives and their families and their work, they don't really get to see that. So I'm hoping this provides a little bit of a window so people can really appreciate how wonderful their community is by having conversations with, different people who enjoy the space.
Yeah, and it's interesting, right? Because when you're talking about enjoying the community, that might mean so many different things to so many people. But I think at the center of our ability to enjoy anything is how connected we feel to that space. And I would say, Daniel, throughout our role working at the town and in the capacity of community development, we've noticed that we've had conversations with many residents who represent a wide spectrum of identities, a wide spectrum of socioeconomic status. And I think it is fair to say that the experience of being connected, feeling like you belong, has a lot to do with the identities that you bring to the table and also the resources, right? Like your socioeconomic status and, how those impact how a person belongs in this community. And one of our primary objectives has always been to increase the access for residents. and exploring what that connectedness is. How do you enjoy the community? How do you belong to the community when perhaps you are not the dominant group, right? You might not have the same resources as everybody else. Because does belonging mean something different, and should it mean something different for
And
you?
I was just going to say, let's jump right into that. So the theme around all these conversations will be the importance of belonging, and just what is that? So when we look at our hierarchy of needs, we know that belonging, a sense of belonging, is a foundational aspect of identity, safety, health. And what are the components really within your community that allow you to feel like you belong? Some of it is physical, some of it is built in infrastructure, but a lot of it is social. And those social senses of belonging is really what we're going to be trying to pull at the threads of. So I'll give you an example. In this past weekend, so this podcast was recorded over the last weeks of May and into June of 2021. So this past weekend, we got a really difficult announcement from the federal government that there was 215 children in unmarked graves located on the grounds of the Kamloops Indian Residential School. This is remarkably difficult information for Canadians to have to unpack and understand. I think it becomes even more challenging when you don't really have a foundation to center that grief with. There was a lot of people who are probably really confused and taking to Google about, what were the residential schools, right? Who was impacted? How does this impact me? What does this mean to Canadian history? And I think in the fortune of being a community development specialist with the town, I've had the opportunity to really spend the last week with our Indigenous allies. Right, and it's been amazing how much emotional care they have provided for me. I was just speaking with Stephen Paquette, who's a local Indigenous leader this past week, and it's interesting. He checked in on me to see how I was feeling with the information, and that was just really astounding. And it really allowed me to, feel like I was supported in terms of my community being there for me receiving terrible information. Whereas, I think all of us were sort of looking to what our role is and what our action should be around that. And that was really an example where I really felt like my community was looking out for me, even though I'm not an Indigenous person. I don't identify as an Indigenous person. However, being connected to that community, I felt like I was a part of something. And just having an Indigenous person check on my grief, was really enlightening.
Yeah, and I think, anytime news like that surfaces, it takes us all back, right? And the focus of these podcasts are to explore belonging, and how does news of 215 unmarked graves of children impact our ability to belong? And what does that mean for our roles within the community to support each other? I've been reflecting a lot about the news that we got and how shocking it was. And one of the things that I reflected on was the grief that I might be experiencing right now as a result of that horrific news. That grief has been experienced by the families of those missing children since the day they went missing, since the day they were taken to the residential schools. And if I am to be an ally, if I'm just to be a neighbor to my community, I have to find a way to give voices to that grief. And you said something so beautiful that, the Indigenous community in Oakville and Halton, they're reaching out to you. They're reaching out to us to see if we're okay. And I think a sense of belonging requires responsibilities on the part of everybody, where it is paramount for us as non-Indigenous people, as settlers in this land, to reach out to our Indigenous communities, to our neighbors, and see what is it that we can do. Because truly, we have just gotten, I would say, a small taste, if that,
a small taste
of the grief,
right,
of the pain. And we've seen all these things where those experiences, those traumatic experiences of those children, were not listened to, were not validated. And should it take 215 unmarked graves for us to now pay attention? And to me, that it increased my awareness of how much more we need to do as a community to support, to acknowledge, to validate, and more importantly, to give voice, because it's not my voice that matters. And through these podcasts, we want to give those voices to the community and to listen to how it is that we can support, because we don't have the solutions and we don't have the answers, but we have a willing ear that's willing to listen and learn.
Right. And I mean, so much is to be said about the importance of belonging for everyone, but there are different groups where the stakes are so high. So using our urban Indigenous neighbors here in Halton as an example, if that is in your family history, the impact of residential schools is going to be so significant that it's impossible for that not to leave a permanent mark on who you are, and to at least have that acknowledged and understood in your community from your neighbors, I can only imagine would be the base surface of expectation, right? So as we go into these conversations, and I believe the first round of our Oakville podcast releases will have our first episode here and then 4 additional episodes, and we'll spend 2 of them talking about Indigenous history and Indigenous peoples. I think it's really important to understand why we need to give so much space to that. So when circumstances like this happen and it grabs the country's attention for a few weeks, this has been a lifetime of pain and grief for generations. Which is why we think it's so important that people build their empathy capacity and understanding for some of the challenges that the groups we speak with have gone through. But not all of it, not all of the conversations we will have will be that of sorrow, sadness, certainly national regret, failures. A lot of it can be celebrations. Like we will have a conversation with the Positive Space Network around Pride and celebrating the 2S LGBTQ plus community, which again, certainly there's lots of challenges that require understanding in order to ensure those folks feel like they belong. But there's so much to celebrate in terms of what we have seen change in our community over the past 20, 30, 40 years. And we actually get a chance to speak with Marcus Logan, who's so the Oakville Public Library is a partner in this podcast. Marcus is a staff member of theirs, and Marcus has been doing advocacy work for 40 years, and it was just kind of wonderful to get his insight. Just ahead of Pride celebrations was really, really exciting.
Yeah, and I think some people might be wondering the platform that we're using to have those conversations, and the idea is recreation and culture is oftentimes a stepping stone to feeling like you belong. And the variety of programming, the content, the people facilitating all need to reflect the diversity of the community that we serve.
Yep.
And so the conversation is not so, we're actually in line with providing that which would organically happen within our community centers itself, within the conversations of people congregating and coming together for a spin class, for a yoga class, for basketball, for public skating. And through those spaces, people are getting to know their neighbors. And their neighbors might be of various different backgrounds, religions, ethnicities, identities, and those interactions are organically happening. With COVID, those conversations might not necessarily be able to take place.
Yeah.
So this platform truly provides us that lens of, number one, acknowledgement that people are not all provided with the same resources. And number two, celebrations, right? That what happens when people are provided with those opportunities? What happens when people can come together and can celebrate, and how beautiful those things are, right? Like I think I've always advocated, and at least my personal belief is that, we don't all have to be the same to be united, and to be, we don't have to conform to be united. We have to be individually, unique and diverse, and, but at the same time, we have to have collective solidarity as a community. And essentially, our roles allows us to create programming that creates those opportunities for connectedness. And so, Daniel, I think it would be, it'd be worthwhile for us to explore a little bit about our journeys to belonging
Sure.
Because I think there's some similarities, there's some overlap, but there's some very unique differences. But at the same time, there's such moments for learning because of those differences.
So I think it's important that I kind of disclose some of my social location before entering these conversations. So for some of you who are not watching video, they're only listening. I'm a 32-year-old white male, married. In having conversations with pride, I have to acknowledge my privilege. Similarly, when discussing Indigenous issues, as we will, and even speaking on seniors issues, I really have to locate myself in terms of where my privilege is in those conversations. But for me, belonging, I'm in the stage of my life where family is absolutely paramount. I have a little baby girl. I'm doing everything I can to create the best possible environment to raise and provide and cultivate a wonderful, happy life. So these conversations about why ensuring that everyone feels safe, supported, included is important to me because my community is one of the strongest assets that I can provide for my child. I need the community to be a vibrant space for her. And I know that I can play a role towards that because I can certainly control what happens in our home. But when she leaves that home, I want the community to be the most positive environment. For me, when I was younger, I certainly benefited from growing up in the Halton region. I thoroughly enjoyed it. For me, it was all about music, friends. When I was younger, I always played music in bands, and that allowed me to form a connection with my peers, allowed me to feel like I was successful, allowed me to be acknowledged for having creativity. It allowed me to express my identity and have that affirmed to me. There are so many places and opportunities, looking at Burlington Sound of Music Festival. That was like a local hub for where artists could come and just be, right? Regardless of how great you were, what kind of music you played, those little systems of self-affirmation and belonging really serves to the residents who get to enjoy it. So when we think about recreation and culture, not necessarily playing a huge role in some of these broader social challenges, it really does provide a tool to ensure that self-affirmation and belonging are actually possible if done effectively. And I'll kind of pick on you because you can share as well. And I believe that there are some similarities, but also vast differences.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely came here to Canada in 1997 as an immigrant. And as you were sharing, I was, for me, I was, as a young person, we want to belong more than anything else, right? Because belonging provides safety. It's the same true as for adults, but as a young, vulnerable person trying to find themselves, we want to belong because it gives us identity and it gives us safety. But as I reflect, I was replicating other people's experiences, mimicking how belonging, what it meant for you, because I thought that's what it would mean to me, and that's the path that I had to take to find that belonging. And so I distinctly remember when I was growing up, I didn't grow up in the Halton region. I grew up in Etobicoke and Mississauga,
And Peel.
right on the border there, and my friends were very much into music as well. And so I thought, well, if they're into music, then I must be into music, right? And so what kind of music are they into? And they were into like all sorts, but hip hop was something that we kind of connected with. And so some of us, some of them were producing music, in their rooms with a mic, I was like, okay, let me give it a shot. Let me think, let me see if I am a rapper as well, right? If I'm somebody who can make hip hop, right? And
if there's recordings, we have to mix it now into the podcast.
And thank goodness that technology back when I was in high school wasn't so advanced that we would, maybe hold on to them as easily as we do. We had like floppy disks, I think, at the time, right? So, but I the reason when you mentioned music, I literally recorded something, right? And it was terrible. It was so bad. And I realized what was happening is I am mimicking, but I'm not creating my own path to belong, right? And that's the experience, I think, of a lot of young people, and I would say a lot of young people of color, a lot of immigrants, because your identity is compounded by the journey of migration, right? People think that, Canada does provide tons of opportunities. I'm privileged enough to be in this position that I am today. But growing up in high school, my mother is from India. My dad is from Bangladesh. I was born in Saudi Arabia, where I lived for 12 years before I came to Canada. And you're asking me, and what's my identity? How do I belong? I have these different
Diaspora,
that I can take from. And the idea is, what am I identifying most with? And what is society around me, the community around me, making it easy for me to accept, right? And I noticed that in certain settings, it was my South Asian identity that was the most prominent, right? And other parts, it was my Muslim identity that was the most prominent. And not necessarily from the lens in which I wanted them to see me as, but from what others saw me as. And, it really impacted how I felt like I belonged, because I felt like I had to potentially hide some of those identities in order to fit in, right? In order to replicate an experience of somebody else who has a very different upbringing than myself. What I ultimately found comfort in was sports. I felt like sports, and I don't know if I mentioned this to you. I used to play baseball at a pretty high level, actually. And I started playing baseball at the age of 13. Like, I started late because I came to Canada at the age of 12. And this is why recreation and sports are so important, because when I started playing baseball, a lot of people around me were white, people of other backgrounds. I didn't know anything about baseball. But what I found was, if you try hard and you work towards a sport, your coaches are supportive, your teammates are supportive, you're working towards a common goal. And I found such solidarity in sports. That transitioned its way over to basketball, to soccer, to track, to cricket. I even played football. And the idea was that music was, it was music for you.
Yep.
I tried to make it music for me, but it wasn't music. For me, it was sports and recreation. And we're talking about community development and belonging when our journey started with recreation and culture, literally two things that, we offer. And I think this is why belonging matters, and belonging is something that we need to talk about, because by creating those pathways, by incorporating those identities and not letting our projections of what others should be determine the type of programs we offer, we truly allow that young person, we allow a younger me to feel like I can belong by playing a sport or by recording a song, right? And you let a Daniel belong by doing those things. So our programming matters. Our programming is a part of a belonging of a young person, and ultimately residents that live in this community.
Yeah, and what you just said too about it being a part. So I don't want listeners to take away that, if my child or to basically dilute someone down to one feature of their identity. That's not what is the role of community, or what we're trying to advocate for. Is that when we allow to have all these different pathways of identity affirmation, belonging, reaffirmment, that's what allows for a person to feel like more of a whole, contributing, accepted member of a community. In our conversation when we were discussing Pride, one of the guests mentioned that, it was Marcus, mentioned that, over doing gay rights advocacy for decades, eventually you just want to stop being identified as the gay man who does rights advocacy, right? And, he explained that he retired from it several times to pursue other professional ventures. Again, because you just never wanted to have one piece of your identity define you, which is why having, a higher level of understanding. So if you are just a member of a community, the higher level of understanding you have about varying different people allows you to be able to see them as who they are, their true nature, rather than just the one aspect of their identity that maybe you don't understand, right? So rather than you being concerned and focused on, the fact that a young lady's wearing a hijab, if you understand why that is being worn, why she believes that's necessary, right, you can start to focus on other aspects of their identity to them, which may allow for them to feel more comfortable in that moment, rather than you being concerned, questioned, or even, maybe just avoidance.
Yeah, and what I'm hearing from you, Daniel, is that this notion that in order for us to belong, the community needs to create a space for people to do so. And ultimately, we know that resources are not evenly distributed. We know that certain communities, certain demographics have more of an influence on determining how people can belong. And so if you by chance don't belong, I didn't, right? I definitely recognize my male privilege. My male privilege definitely got me in spaces to belong. Then, if I didn't identify as a male. But what about the color of my skin? What about my socioeconomic status, right? Are those needs reflected by the community, and are those resources available to me by the community, right? And what I heard was, when we become learners, truly invest in learning and understanding about people who might not necessarily look like us, have the same practices as us, identify the same as us, we simply increase that space for people to belong, right? And I think it's really important to identify that when I learn about different cultures, when I learn about your culture, Dan, and you might learn about my culture, I'm not saying you have to agree with everything that I'm saying and just be homogenous, just like me, just be like me, right?
Yeah.
What I'm saying is, this is what makes us unique, which means we are invariably different, but that difference should not be something that limits my ability to belong or increases your ability to belong, right? Because that is literally the definition of oppression, is the exploitation of differences. So we're not saying everybody needs to be on this, everybody needs to agree with everything, but we need to say that differences cannot be the basis of how we treat each other in an oppressive way.
And I will say that, and obviously those listening appreciate that, but if it's not enough just to exist in a community, right? A community requires some individual accountability to contribute as well, right? We spoke a lot about this in our conversation regarding seniors, or in preparation, just noting the amount of hours to the social service system that seniors volunteer, right? I'm not saying that everyone has to volunteer, but everyone has an individual responsibility to learn about how they can ensure the community is a better place. When I talked about, wanting to ensure the community is a better space for my child, I recognize that part of that is my job and how I treat other people. I think that part of it, and I'll use you for an example, you identified yourself as a Muslim person, right? It is incumbent on me to understand how I can value that aspect of your identity to ensure that you are most comfortable to be yourself, right? Taking example, Friday prayer, right? By acknowledging that is an aspect of your life, you don't have to be worried about me sneaking Friday afternoon meetings into your calendar. You don't have to worry about, when we're off-site, finding places to pray, because that'll be built into our relationship, is that I know that that's something you need. We don't have to speak about it. It's simply something that we identify as a need, just like any other, physical, social, emotional need that we have. It can be met, and that can allow you to be more comfortable in your interactions, and myself to be more comfortable too, because I know that those who I'm surrounding myself are having their needs met.
Yeah, and I think, that the idea is the impact that it has on that individual who now feels welcomed and not feels different as a result of it, right? I can honestly speak to the fact that growing up, it takes a lot of courage, the voice to be able to stand up for being different. And then, I came to the realization that in a pluralistic, diverse community, we're all different in some capacities. And so to have the courage and the confidence to be different, and hold on to that which makes you different, and be proud of that which makes you different, needs society to create those spaces, just like you had said. And I think when we do that, what ends up happening is we don't lead with fear, right? Like, I think the other thing with belonging is we feel safe. But when we're afraid to create space, we're actually leading with the fear of what happens. And I think this is my journey of learning, is that I want to mitigate the fear of getting to know more. And I think I mentioned this in one of our other programs. A really great, Gabor Mate, who's a Canadian physician and has done a lot of great work. He said, it's not what you know, it's what you can know.
Yep.
And so the ability to know more, really creates a space for people to feel comfortable, because now that I might know more about your ancestry, your background, it just helps me understand you a little bit more. And I'm not afraid of that. I'm not leading with fear to what happens if I know a little bit more. Because again, I think diversity does not mean we are the same. We don't all have to become one. We just simply have to understand that this is how society can exist and spaces of belonging can be created when we just know each other more.
And not to make this a like financial discussion, but Oakville is not an inexpensive place to purchase property, right?
Yes.
If you are deciding to invest, say, in moving your family or relocating in Oakville, this is not a low expense, right? The stakes financially are high when it comes to ensuring that this is a great community, right? I think everyone listening, if you are an Oakville resident, you are aware that, there is a lot of value to living in Oakville. We've seen values rise in properties. We've seen values rise in terms of the increased diversity and social inclusion and culture that has come to Oakville. But in order to retain this value and the importance, or I guess the privilege of calling Oakville a home, is that we have to put in the work to maintain this level of community and belonging so it stays this incredible space where we get to enjoy community. Now, I know that it's not the same remarkable experience for all individuals, which is why we have to do the work, have the conversations, but it's worth it.
Yes.
It's worth it. Like this is where you decide to call home. It has to be worth it.
I think, you speak to I've always wondered home ownership and what does that mean to own a home in Oakville, right? Because we are a very affluent community,
Yep.
Though not all residents in our community experience the same level of affluency or have access to the same number of resources. But I do think it means something to live in Oakville. Like, Halton is the safest community in all of Canada. Oakville has great amenities, infrastructure, and just that sense of, I think people move to Oakville very intentionally.
Yeah, absolutely. It is a destination to be sought.
Right. Which means if you move here intentionally, everybody might have varied reasons, and hence they require different types of spaces to find that, that belonging. And as Oakville is becoming more diverse, we're seeing that change north of the QEW to south of the QEW, right? The diversity,
Yeah.
the new developments it's apparent. We as a community need to embrace that change and embrace, what does that mean for how things used to look versus how things are going to look. And that's a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
Right? And what can we do in our roles as community development specialists to ensure that we're optimizing those opportunities and not being scared off by it, right? I think that the idea is somebody who might move in next door to us that might speak a language that we're not familiar with. Is that something that makes us not interact with those individuals, or do we find different means of connecting with people, right? I distinctly remember when I was growing up, I had a Polish neighbor, and he had a basketball net. That's how we got to know each other, because he had a basketball net, so he would go and shoot hoops.
Yeah.
And then I was like, can I shoot the basketball with you and get to know them? And I don't think I met a person, or I got to really know somebody who had a Polish background, and I got to know so much more about, I don't
Yeah.
want to stereotype, but like the food, the Polish culture, and they got to know so much about my culture, and like Ramadan, fasting, and what that meant. And we would then like go over and give them food when we were about to open our fast. We gave them some food so that they could enjoy the same type of meals that we're enjoying, right? But that only came from that space to be like,
Yes.
belonging for you was a basketball net, and belonging for me might have been giving you a tray full of samosas, for example,
Yep.
right? What a beautiful thing, right? Like if all I
Yeah.
wanted my neighbors to be the same as us, or to maybe even speak the same language as us, we miss out on those opportunities to learn so much more about different cultures.
Yeah, I spent the first part of my professional career working as a personal support worker. And for those who have done this type of work before, working with individuals with developmental disabilities, it is important to understand diagnosis and behaviors and symptoms. However, having a base understanding of some of the conditions that arise from a primary diagnosis of a developmental disability is great to know. However, as you build more of an understanding of the individual, you're really able to separate behaviors related to the individual's disability to the individual. And the more and more time you spend, similar to, any member of our community, the more time, comfort, patience, acceptance that you give, the more and more you start to understand about their identity. And I'm proud to say that, like, I've lived my life with years where, like, a man with Down syndrome was one of my best friends, because I just had the opportunity to get to that level with him where I knew these are the items of support that I have to provide based on the challenges that you experience due to your disability. However, there is an endless supply of just social behavior, skill, talent, intelligence, quirk that is there as soon as you have that base level of understanding of what their needs are. And once you understand someone's needs, you really, really get to build a bigger appreciation for who they are.
Right. You see them for not who you think they are.
That's right, yeah.
You see them for who they are.
And if you just keep walking, or if you just don't spend the time to understand, especially, and I know it's so difficult to have a great understanding of all people in the community, but life is long. And we can learn something new every day, especially if we just approach it with empathy and the willingness to learn. I think that adaptability and malleability to understand different people is something that really, you should never finish, right? You've never finished your level of understanding for other individuals. You're always kind of growing in terms of your appreciation and understanding. And I think that allows you to continue with fulfillment in your life, because you're just open to so many more relationships, people, culture, vibrancy, food.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's the surface level of, like, inclusion, which is, oftentimes food and cultural celebrations, which I think is a great gateway to deeper, meaningful conversations, right? And so we partake in those sometimes superficial celebrations, but at the same time, we want to leverage those, celebrations to be able to get to know individuals, give them voice. I think, as I was speaking to my experience, one of the things I truly found empowering in sports was the fact that I had a voice. The fact that, if I tried hard, I was supported, my voice came out, my confidence came out, my ability to identify. This is an interesting story, but in one of our league games, at the conclusion of the game, there was pizza. I think a family member, one of the families bought pizza. So I'm eating pizza. I'm Muslim. I don't eat pepperoni or pork. Yeah. And it was like there was cheese covering it. So I was like, oh, it's cheese pizza, I think, right? So I ate an entire slice, but I'm like, this cheese does not taste like that pizza that I've had before. Yeah. And then I'm eating my second slice, and as I'm taking the bite out, I just see like pepperoni just like sticking out of my mouth, and I'm like, oh no, like that's kind of a big deal. Like, I shouldn't be doing this, right? Obviously, it was unintentional. It was goodwilled on behalf of everybody. And I remember I gargled my mouth with Coke because I was like, I need to get this taste out. I feel what have I done? But then I was like, hey, next time can we have like pepperoni and cheese pizza, if that's okay? And the learnings that we went through, like sometimes they would get half pepperoni, half cheese on the same pizza. But that might not necessarily, some people might be okay with that. I was like, I would be more comfortable if there were two separate pizzas, right? Small interactions that can change,
I appreciate you being vulnerable to be able to share that, because there might be people listening that's like, what is he talking about?
Right.
So it's important that you kind of shared that story. Much appreciated.
Right, and I think this is the essence of a community, right? Yeah. It's like, as a municipality, obviously we have infrastructure, we have programming, and we aim to create organic situations by offering programs where people can come together and have those conversations, right? Where you might understand a little bit more about kosher food, for example, right? And halal food or zabiha food, or a vegan diet. Like, these are things that if you don't yourself, engage in, but maybe your neighbor does. And where best to have those conversations than a community center, then a program that the town of Oakville offers. This creates belonging. But I think as we're becoming more diverse, and we're going to get to the episodes and sort of the
Yep.
focuses of our podcast, why certain communities have not traditionally experienced potentially that same level of organic conversations because of potential how systems have operated, against them in some situations, and how we as a community need to be more intentional in how we have those conversations and how we create those spaces, right? So I don't know if you want, I know you
Yeah.
walked us briefly through it, but just to
Yeah,
summarize.
So basically, so our first release of the OurOakville podcast, you're going to hear 4 conversations. With June being National Indigenous History Month, we thought it was important to identify. So one of the episodes you'll hear is us speaking with Darren Wabenga from the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. He's going to walk us through a bit of understanding around treaty and history in terms of Oakville and Halton, the land. So we're looking forward to learning a bit more about Indigenous history. We're also going to have a conversation with Indigenous people. We're going to speak with Angela Bellegarde from the Our Kids Network. She will be joining us just as a resident, as she's an urban Indigenous woman living in the Halton region. And we're just going to speak about what that experience looks like, as she's been enjoying the space for over 15 years and has some great anecdotes and experiences to share. We'll also, to celebrate Pride Month, we will be speaking with Matt and Fee from the Positive Space Network, and we're going to invite Marcus from the library to join us as a guest host for that, because we really feel like Marcus has some expertise and great historical context to the work of 2S LGBTQ plus history here in the Oakville Halton area. And then you'll also hear with June is Seniors Month. We're also going to speak with Heather from Community Development Halton, who does the age-friendly initiatives, which is really a lot of work around organizing seniors to be both connected with their Seniors Connectors program, but also volunteers through the Volunteer Halton branch of the work that they do. And joining Heather will be Ruth Sheridan, who's a local senior resident, who's going to speak about just her subjective personal experience being a senior in Oakville. So that's what folks can expect in the upcoming episodes. Now, before we wrap this episode up, I think we did a great,
knocked it out of the park, home run.
Yeah, I think the conversations that everyone's going to get to enjoy are wonderful. But this is our first time doing a podcast, so I thought it would be valuable for us to acknowledge that, God, we wanted to accomplish so much from these conversations. Just like anything, time is limited, scope is always limited. So, when listening to the conversations, just understanding that they are really only indicative of the people having those conversations. So I can only ask questions that I have access to in terms of what I see as valuable and important to drive the conversation. Likewise to yourself. So if you're listening, being like, talk about this, this is important, especially when it comes to things like Indigenous history, pride, seniors, there is so much that is important, and we can't get to everything. We're not sure if we're going to do more episodes, but we took a kick at the can, and if you're, shouting at your earbuds, being like, why didn't you speak about this? Why didn't you speak about this? If you are interested, please provide feedback. We'd love to hear it. But yeah, I wanted to acknowledge that we really tried, and we really feel like we had intentional conversations, but it's just us. And for those who we interviewed, it's just them.
Right, and I think, we're leading with vulnerability, right? We're leading with creativity, not expertise, and we don't claim to be experts in any of those spaces, right? And I think you're absolutely right. It's important to acknowledge that's what we're leading with. We're providing a different way of engaging our audience, a different way of learning, a different way of interacting. And one of my biggest takeaways is that the individuals that we're speaking to, right? There's so much knowledge there that it like you said, it's very difficult. Like when you talk about Marcus, Marcus has been somebody who's championed not just the LGBTQ.
Press record and let him go off. Yeah.
Right, and he's championed community, in Oakville and in Halton. Angela, just a pleasure to be around. And Darren, when we connected with him, I was I was so engaged in everything that he was saying because it was like you could ask him anything and he would know the dates.
He would do his best to provide the most informed answer.
Right.
Which is so needed. Yeah.
And you know, as you said that, then I was thinking like how much of so many of the things, the conversation we had, I didn't know.
Yeah.
And then information was available. It was available in our community. It was there. And I think that's the hope that these podcasts creates this channel for interaction, for learning, and then for maybe an intrigue to learn more.
Spark more curiosity.
Right. Yeah. And so we're hoping that, you know, this is what the podcast represents. You know, we always want to be better. And so feedback is always welcomed. But the idea is the conversations are important. And the way in which we're having those conversations, perhaps they can be better. But let's pay attention to the content of what it is that we're trying to learn and how is it that people feel that sense of belonging in Oakville.
Absolutely. So we invite you to listen to the remainder of the episodes. We sincerely thank our guests. We thank the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation for being the stewards of the land that we are sitting on now, that we get to enjoy and we get to present this podcast from. Yeah, and we hope you enjoy, and maybe someday we'll be back with more conversation. Otherwise, as community members of Oakville or in the broader Halton area, we just ask that you listen with an open mind, open ears, and open heart, and we all work together to try to build a better community because that's all we want. Everyone listening wants to live in a place that they can love, that they can feel safe, and that they can raise and cherish family. And so let's do it. All right. Enjoy.
Let's get started. Thank you so much for listening, guys. We'll see you next time.